Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of the Negro League baseball teams. We're going to meet with Robert Scott, who was a player with the New York Black Yankees from 1946 to 1950. We're also going to speak with Dr. Lawrence Hogan, Professor of History Emeritus at Union County College. Dr. Hogan is the author of So Many Seasons in the Sun, and also The Forgotten History of African American Baseball. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Larry and Bob, welcome to the show. When we talk about the history of baseball, we often think of it as a segregated sport, when the reality is in the 19th century it was first an integrated, then segregated, and then an integrated sport. Can you talk about the earliest history of it?
So frequently people will say Jackie was the first. He wasn't the first. He was the second, maybe the third, possibly even the fourth, because in the 1870s and the 80s, when professional baseball is coming into being in this country, and the National League comes into being in 1875, blacks were playing on teams that were integrated teams. We can't call them white teams. We have records of about 30 or so blacks in that era from about, well, it's Reconstruction time down to the beginnings of the 20th century, the last decade of the 19th. Where these players played on strong minor league teams, and in a couple of instances, the most famous being Moses Fleetwood Walker in 1884, actually playing on a major league team, the American Association team out in Toledo, which was a major league that year. So technically speaking, black baseball didn't exist separate from white baseball in the earliest stages of. But as America commits to segregation, to a segregated order, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the famous Supreme Court case, separate but equal, that was already happening out on baseball diamonds because blacks were gradually being pushed out of the game. Okay. And by the midpoint of the 1890s, it's a segregated sport, and now we're waiting for Jackie.
Right, okay. And for New Jersey, what were some of the prominent teams in New Jersey?
Well, right from the beginning, I mean, the first of the black professional teams that we have that designation attached to, the first black professional baseball team, organized in Babylon, Long Island in 1884 and 1885 in a resort area, plays in the 1886 season down in Trenton, the original Cuban Giants. So right at the beginning of the story, Jersey has a claim on black baseball.
Now, the name Cuban Giants, I mean, I find that interesting because that name is meant in some respect to have acceptance for some of the African American players. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's always been difficult to sort out exactly the specifics of how that name gets attached to this particular team, but it's pretty clear that what was involved was some thinking about how to deal with segregation, with racism at that point in time. And if you were a Cuban, then you weren't quite as bad as being a black, a Negro it would have been at the time, or they would have said, you know, in the real racist terminology of that time period. Oh, they're Cubans. Well, they're, you know, a little bit different then. So yeah, we suspect that that's how the name comes to be for this particular club.
And so when is the formation of the Negro Leagues?
Well, we wait for quite a while. We wait for segregation to push the blacks out of. We wait then around the turn of the century when blacks begin to organize their own touring teams, great teams, Philadelphia Giants, the Brooklyn Royal Giants, Chicago American Giants. Everybody loved that name, the moniker, the Giants. It isn't until 1920 that a formal league structure comes into being, organized largely by the person who's tagged as the father of black baseball in the 20th century, Andrew Rube Foster. But there's a host of other folks involved in it too. A guy named Ed Bolden in the East, another guy named Taylor who had the team out in Indiana, the Indianapolis ABCs, and a host of other significant black businessmen, basically, who brought this structure into being.
Right. And Bob, you're a living legacy to the league. I mean, the tail end of it. Can you talk to me a little bit about your involvement and what team you played for?
Well, I started playing in 1946 for the New York Black Yankees, and I started my career in Macon, Georgia, where I played a lot of baseball there before I was signed by the Black Yankees. And I thought that was the greatest thing that I ever could do, play baseball. And when I was signed by the Black Yankees, I thought I was the greatest ball player I ever saw, coming out of Macon, Georgia. 16-year-old young black kid could throw harder than the Georgia Mule could kick. But actually, my cousin, he passed away, but he is the cause of me to be a ball player today, because he said to me that, you know, you're playing here in Macon, and you got qualification. You're a better ball player, so I'm going to take you down and give you a try with one of them Negro League teams. So that we had the Homestead Grays.
Okay.
Was playing the Black Yankees coming out of Florida, you know, coming north, and I got a chance to show the manager, his name was Hack Barker, show him what I could do. And he told me to sit down, and I threw a few pitches. He said, sit down. And finally, through the game, he started talking to me, and he said to me, you think you could leave home? I said, I don't know you. Back then, you just couldn't leave home. You had to get the permission. So I had to ask my parents if I could go.
And what would they say?
Oh man, my mother she was thrilled. She was thrilled to death, because she loved baseball, and she wanted me to play the game of baseball. So she was thrilled to death for me to play.
And so you played for the New York Black Yankees between 1946 and 1950?
Yes.
Yeah, and what position?
I was a pitcher and a first baseman. Yeah, and you know, I was pretty good there back then. So you had to be good to even play in that league, for them to think about you. Yeah, because back then they tell you you can't make it. You got to go back home and start shuffling corn. You know, but baseball players today, I see these players today making $6 million. They couldn't make it. They couldn't make it back in those days. I mean, you back then, when you talk baseball, you had white players who was good too. They was good because they was trying to get a job, and a lot of them come up from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. They come from the mills, cotton mills, and they was good ball players. And most of the time that the white players would want to play us, because they wanted to know how good how good they was, so that they can play competition like playing in the Negro League teams. But it never happened because of the I think the politician could control that. But playing in the Negro League was a thrill for me. I enjoy it. Yeah.
So, Larry, take us to the earliest history then of the Negro Leagues. How popular was it at the time, and its growth during the early 1920s?
In 1920, when Rube Foster in Kansas City, the Maceo YMCA is the place where they're organized, the Black YMCA. So frequently the black world of institutions worked to connect one to another. In this instance, it was just natural that they meet there. And when he put out the call, he got a fine response from a host of teams that had been in existence for a good period of time, starting right around the turn of the century when black professional baseball begins to have these great barnstorming teams coming into being. But it was primarily a Midwestern league that he brought into being. There were great teams in the East that were out of that structure, but they organized themselves in 1923. The second Negro major league comes into being. It's called the Eastern Colored League. And teams ranging from Atlantic City to Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York, Lincoln Giants in New York, Atlantic City Bacharach Giants, which we should talk about given the focus on New Jersey, established that second league. And in 1924, then, we get the first Negro League World Series. And that league structure basically lasts down through 1927, begins to fall apart in 28 with the onset of the Depression, and then basically isn't there. A lot of the teams survived through the Depression era, barely, holding on and whatnot, playing independently, and then the Negro Leagues come back into being by 1937. Into 38, we've got, again, a two-league structure, a Western League and an Eastern League.
Okay. And so let's then segue into the teams in New Jersey. You mentioned the Bacharach Giants, named after, I think, the mayor of Atlantic City at the time. Can you elaborate a little bit more about them and some of the other teams in New Jersey?
Well, it's 1916, and Harry Bacharach, who would be a political force in Atlantic City and state politics, as a young man coming into politics and running for the mayor's position in Atlantic City, has his name attached to this team. A couple of black businessmen know this team is strong. It's a team that already exists down in Florida. And they go to the mayor and ask the mayor if he would lend some support to, or he's not the mayor, he's running for mayor. That's an important distinction here. And asked the candidate for the mayor's position if he would lend some support. And by that time, there's a significant enough black constituency in Atlantic City, particularly in the resorts, hotels, and whatnot, so that it makes sense for him to be identified with a black baseball team. He's appealing to that constituency, and so he does. He lends his name to it. He, lends some money for uniforms and whatnot. And this team, it's like a meteor almost coming in. When you read in the Atlantic City press the accounts of this team coming into being and establishing itself from 16 to 23, then they're one of the founding members of the Eastern Colored League. They're widely heralded. They're playing all comers and beating them handily. It's really a very, very fine team, and one of the greatest of the players to come off of that club, he manages it for a couple of years in the early 1920s, is John Henry Pop Lloyd. Greatest shortstop ever to play the game of baseball. I didn't say greatest black shortstop ever to play the game of baseball. I said greatest shortstop ever to play the game of baseball. Incredible baseball player. From Bob's territory, he comes in 1906 from Macon, Georgia. So this guy's coming out of, an interesting heritage there. And Pop will then, when he starts to go into decline as a player, come and settle in Atlantic City. He's still playing, and he's still playing on a semi-pro level in Atlantic City through the 1930s into the 1940s. This famous, is it HBO show? Boardwalk Empire. Yeah, Nookie Johnson. Well, he's playing for the Johnson All-Stars because Nookie, another politician in Atlantic City, wants to identify with blacks because politically they're going to vote for, him. So Pop has a wonderful career in Atlantic City. He ends up as a janitor in the high schools and influences. Jim Ushry, the first black mayor of Atlantic City, would talk about the influence that Pop had on him as a high school kid, going through the high school there, and Pop was a mentor to a lot of kids. So it's a very wonderful history.
So what about other areas of New Jersey, other urban areas, Newark or Patterson? Were there teams there as well?
Yeah, very much so. 36, the legendary Newark Eagles come to Newark, New Jersey, playing in Rupert Stadium, renting the stadium from the Yankees. When the Yankees are out of town, you know, it's an incredible baseball moment in the 30s and 40s in Newark, because arguably two of the greatest teams ever to play the game of baseball are in the same city. One's a white team, the Newark Bears, arguably the greatest minor league team ever to play baseball. Yankee farm team, you know, Berra, Yogi, Rizzuto, Phil, you know, list the whole great number of Yankees who played there before they went up to the Yankees, played for the Newark Bears. And then the Newark Eagles. 9 players from the Newark Eagles are in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And just the names. I mean, Monty Irvin, Larry Doby, Rollie Bismacki, Leon Day, Ray Dandridge, you know, and the only woman, and I've left off a couple, there's a couple of others, Willie Wells and Mule Suttles. Yeah. And the only woman ever elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Effa Manley. Yeah. So, ooh, wow, that's something else. Yeah. And they never played each other. They played in the same stadium, but they never faced off against each other because of, you know, racial discrimination and segregation.
Yeah. So what's, just out of curiosity, what's left of some of these stadiums today? Do some of them survive today?
Well, unfortunately, most of them are gone. I mean, even the teams ended up playing in major league stadiums extensively after 1930. They did a little bit before 32, but Yankee Stadium gets opened in 1930 to Negro League play. And this guy plays Yankee Stadium. That's where the Black Yankees are. Most of the stadiums are gone, even the major league stadiums. The old Yankee Stadium is gone, the Polo Grounds is gone, Ebbets Field is gone, Rupert Stadium in Newark is gone. One surviving stadium here in Jersey that is arguably the last stadium in existence, with maybe Rickwood Field down in Birmingham, but then that's not quite the level of play up here, that hosted significant Negro League play in the 1930s particularly, and that's Hinchcliffe Stadium in Paterson. And that stadium, unfortunately, was allowed to go into decline, disgrace that it was, but it's still standing, and a major effort is underway. We just secured National Historic Registry status for Hinchcliffe Stadium, and so, you know, at least that's still there as a landmark place.
And Bob, can you tell me a bit about some of the, I guess, the travels, going to different stadiums and playing different teams? What are your memories of that?
Oh, well, that was great. I mean, well, a lot of times, a lot of people didn't know how we traveled. They thought maybe we traveled 600 miles or we traveled 800 miles. Sometimes we did. But actually, what we did do is that we would play in Philadelphia. Now we might play in Richmond, Virginia. Okay. And the next night we might play in Atlanta, Georgia. And the next we may play in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, all the time we was traveling 250, 300 miles like that. But the long trip we used to take trips that could go out west. When you go out to Houston, from New York to Houston, and trips like that. Now, when we go out there, we play our way back to New York. So it's kind of like the major league set up today. And they what they do is they take the long trip, and then they further way back home. You know, they stop at different city. But if you look at the way that the major league was set up, the Negro League was set up the same way. 8 teams in 2 leagues. You had all these teams that the professor mentioned that played two leagues, the American League and the National League, all just the same as a white league. The only difference between the 2 leagues was they was white and we was black, and the ball was still white.
You mentioned Effa Manley. I was wondering if we could elaborate a little bit more on her, because she's a fascinating character. I mean, she grows up in it's a mixed family, I believe. And if you could, elaborate a little bit more about her.
She was an incredible lady, way ahead of her time in so many ways. Women coming forward at that time, just in the way that she did, was not expected. She married a significant man in his own right, Abe Manley, who was the owner of the team. But as far as managing the business side of it, it was very much Effa who did that. It was very much Effa. Abe had a good baseball sense, and he went out and scouted frequently. And a lot of the players who end up on the Eagles come because of that. But once they were on the Eagles, they were Effa's boys, and she negotiated the contracts, and she kept them in line in terms of the standards that she put forward. I would get a laugh from my friend Max Manning, who was a great pitcher with the Eagles, when he would talk about that and her expectations of what she had for these players. So yeah, remarkable lady, and of course she is the only lady ever elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
And so she's involved with the Nork Eagles.
She's in effect the general manager. Some people would say the business manager. She's the general manager of the Eagles. She did all of the publicity. She handled the negotiations in terms of contracts with the players. She was secretary for a while and always an active participant in league affairs. So, yeah, she was quite a lady.
And I seem to recall her records of her and the team, they were discovered in the basement of one of the buildings. She lived in much later, in the 1980s, was it?
Yeah. I discovered those records, and it was just such a delight. A serendipitous kind of thing. I had a wonderful student, Doris Collins Benjamin, who I had in one of my African American history classes, and Doris was a lady up in her 70s at the time, and very much connected, Doris was. And Doris called me one day and said, "Larry, there's word on the street that," and whoa, Doris, let me hear about it. And it was pretty quickly, I connected to the person who had the records. He had purchased the building, the apartment building that Abe and Effa had lived in, and they had lost, and it went, public sale or whatever, and he purchased it, was restoring it beautifully. And I went over and met with him, and he took me downstairs into the basement, and there were 2 file drawers, 4 files each. Oh my goodness, the operational records of it. And I said to him, Eric Adams was his name. I said, "Mr. Adams," I said, the reality is you've got something valuable here if you want. But I said it should really stay together and go to a place like the Newark Library, and just like that, he said, great. Yes. So we have the best record that we have of any team. Primary source record that we have of any team is the Newark Eagles at the Newark Public Library.
Great. Well, let's talk about breaking the color barrier, I guess, for the second time here, with Jackie Robinson's connection with New Jersey.
Well, it's 1946. It's April the 18th, 1946. It's the Montreal Royals coming into play against the Jersey City Giants, the Giants farm team. Jackie had been signed in December of '45, so this is his debut. That's when the color barrier is actually broken in professional baseball. I know Ebbets Field, and obviously that's tremendously important, but if you go up to Jersey City today, you'll see a statue of Jackie commemorating that fact. So it happens there first.
And I'm interested too in knowing what you obviously extensively have studied the subject. What was the interest that brought you about to study the Negro League baseball and the history as well?
The baseball part of it, I always say, must have started in my mother's womb, because I can't ever remember a time when I wasn't in love with baseball. Growing up in the New York area, in Stamford, Connecticut, Willie Mickey and the Duke, Yankee rooter from very early on. People always say, "Why weren't you Dodgers rooter?" Well, it's easy. I was 5 and 6 years old, and the Yankees were winning all the time. So, but that's where the baseball stuff comes from, and the black baseball stuff comes from my exposure to the black press in the 1970s. My dissertation, which became a book, A Black National News Service, the Associate Negro Press, which was a AP UPI for black papers, and the great papers, the Defender in Chicago, the Baltimore Afro-American, everywhere you went, Pittsburgh Courier, full of this baseball stuff. And I'm not writing about it, but I'm looking at it.
Right.
You know, I'm going to the sports pages, finding Scott there. You know, I didn't know him at the time, but he's on those sports pages. And then Bob Peterson's pioneering work got me awfully interested. John Holloway's pioneering work too in this area. So that's a little bit of it, yeah.
And Bob, tell me, so you played baseball up until 1950. Did you play afterwards as well?
The Negro League actually broke up in 1950. Mm-hmm. And it continue on because most of the teams left from the east, they went west. So they was playing out in the west, like Birmingham, Kansas City, you know, teams like that. And all the Negro League teams in the east was demolished because you didn't have no fans. When I start talking about the Negro League, I get a little choked up, you know. Yeah. And it was wonderful. And the professor was talking about Jackie Robinson when he comes up. Jackie, you know, I played with his team, All-Star team in 1950. Mm-hmm. And Jackie Robinson was one of the greatest men I ever met. But he was not the best ball player, but he was a great person for what Ben Rickey bring him in to do. Right. And Jackie made everything possible for all of us.
Yeah. Huh. Well, Bob, I want to thank you for sharing your memories, and also Larry for talking about the history and tying it all together. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I enjoy it.